You're a disgrace to the Thornfield name, Victoria. Standing there in that cheap dress, pretending to grieve someone who never wanted you here in the first place. Aunt Clarissa's voice cut through the somber atmosphere of Rosewood Memorial Chapel like a blade, her words echoing off the mahogany walls as mourners turned to stare. I stood, frozen beside my grandmother's casket, still clutching the single white rose I had planned to place on her chest, while the woman who had raised me lay silent and still, just inches away. The funeral parlor fell into an uncomfortable silence as Clarissa Thornfield-Hartwell stepped closer, her designer black Chanel suit a stark contrast to my simple Target dress. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed at me like I was some kind of exhibit in a museum of family failures. "Evelyn spoiled you rotten," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "Let you live in that mansion rent-free, gave you everything, and this is how you repay her memory? By showing up here looking like some common street person?" I am Victoria Rose Winters, 28 years old, and until this moment, I thought I understood what grief felt like. I thought I knew what it meant to lose the only person who had ever truly loved me unconditionally. But as I stood there, in the Rosewood Memorial Chapel in Millbrook, Connecticut, surrounded by relatives who had treated me like an unwelcome guest my entire life, I realized that some pain cuts deeper than loss itself. For 25 years, I had lived with my grandmother Evelyn in her sprawling Victorian estate on Elm Hill Road. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 3, and Grandma Evelyn had taken me in without hesitation, despite the obvious disapproval of the rest of the Thornfield family. She had raised me with kindness, wisdom, and unconditional love in a house that felt more like a fairy tale castle than a home. But as I watched Uncle Harold nod approvingly at his wife's public humiliation of me, while Cousin Patricia smirked from the front row, I realized how naive I had been about my place in this family's hierarchy. "The girl never even had a real job," Patricia whispered, loud enough for half the chapel to hear. 28 years old and still living off grandmother's charity like some kind of parasite. The words stung, because there was just enough truth in them to hurt. I had worked part-time at the Millbrook Public Library, but it wasn't exactly a career that screamed independence. Grandma Evelyn had always insisted I focus on my art, my painting, telling me that creativity was a gift that shouldn't be sacrificed for conventional success. She had supported my dreams when no one else in the family even acknowledged I had any. "Look at her," Clarissa continued, apparently not finished with her performance. "Can't even afford proper funeral attire. Evelyn wasted decades and hundreds of thousands of dollars on this charity case when she should have been thinking about family. Real family." I felt the heat of dozens of eyes on me as other mourners, family friends, business associates, and distant relatives turned to witness my public shaming. Some seemed embarrassed by the display. Others seemed to be enjoying the drama. The funeral director, Mr. Jameson, stood uncomfortably by the door, clearly unsure whether to intervene in what was rapidly becoming a family spectacle. "That's enough, Clarissa," came a quiet but firm voice from the back of the chapel. Everyone turned to see James Morrison, Grandma Evelyn's longtime attorney, standing in the doorway with his leather briefcase clutched tightly in his weathered hands. His gray hair was perfectly combed despite the October wind outside, and his kind eyes held a mixture of sadness and something else I couldn't quite identify. Mr. Morrison continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been handling Thornfield family business for over 30 years. "This is neither the time nor the place for such discussions. We're here to honor Evelyn's memory, not to air family grievances." Clarissa's face flushed red with indignation. "James, you of all people know how she squandered the family fortune on this girl. Someone needs to speak the truth about what Evelyn's charitable impulses have cost this family." Uncle Harold stood up from the front row, straightening his expensive suit jacket. "Clarissa's right, Morrison. We've all been too polite for too long. The girl needs to understand that the gravy train has stopped. Evelyn's gone now, and it's time for Victoria to learn how the real world works. As I stood there listening to them discuss my future as if I weren't even present, something cold and hard settled in my chest. These people had tolerated me for 25 years because they had to, because Grandma Evelyn demanded it. But now that she was gone, they were showing their true colors with a cruelty that took my breath away. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, is that Grandma Evelyn had never been as naive about their intentions as they believed. In the quiet moments we shared together during her final months, she had seen exactly who they were, exactly what they would do once she was no longer there to protect me. "We'll see about that," Mr. Morrison said quietly, his words so soft that only those in the front rows could hear them clearly. But something in his tone made Clarissa's confident smirk falter for just a moment. As the funeral director finally stepped forward to restore order and continue the service, I placed my white rose on Grandma Evelyn's casket and whispered a silent promise to her memory. They thought they knew what was coming. They thought they had it all figured out. They had no idea what my grandmother had really planned for them. The heavy scent of lilies and carnations seemed to thicken the air as Mr. Jameson cleared his throat and gestured for everyone to take their seats. The chapel's stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the polished wooden pews, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that felt completely at odds with the ugly scene that had just unfolded. I could feel the weight of every stare as I walked down the burgundy carpeted aisle toward the back of the chapel, my footsteps muffled but somehow still echoing in the uncomfortable silence. The cheap fabric of my black dress suddenly felt like sandpaper against my skin, and I became acutely aware of every imperfection Clarissa had so publicly pointed out. The slightly frayed hem I had tried to hide, the discount store shoes that squeaked softly with each step, the absence of jewelry except for the small silver locket Grandma Evelyn had given me for my 16th birthday. Behind me, I could hear the satisfied murmur of Thornfield family members settling into their prominent seats in the front rows. Clarissa's voice carried clearly as she made no effort to lower it while speaking to her husband. Well, that needed to be said. Someone had to draw the line somewhere. The girl's been living in a fantasy for far too long. Harold's rumbling agreement mixed with Patricia's barely suppressed laughter, creating a soundtrack of cruelty that seemed to follow me as I found an empty seat in the very last row beside an elderly woman I didn't recognize who gave me a sympathetic smile. From my position in the back, I had a clear view of the elaborate funeral arrangements that Clarissa had insisted on organizing. White orchids cascaded from tall silver stands, and an enormous spray of roses covered half of Grandma Evelyn's mahogany casket. The funeral program in my trembling hands listed a full schedule of speakers. Uncle Harold would deliver the main eulogy, Clarissa would share family memories, and Patricia would read a poem she had supposedly written for the occasion. My name appeared nowhere on the program. The woman who had raised me, who had been my mother, father, best friend, and biggest supporter for 25 years, was being memorialized by people who had barely tolerated her generosity and had actively resented my presence in their lives. They were erasing me from her story, even as they laid her to rest. Mr. Morrison had taken a seat near the middle of the chapel, his briefcase positioned carefully beside him. I noticed he kept checking his watch and glancing around the room as if he were waiting for something. His usually calm demeanor seemed slightly agitated, and twice I saw him pull out his phone to check for messages before putting it away again. As Harold began his eulogy, speaking in platitudes about Evelyn's generous spirit and dedication to family, I closed my eyes and tried to block out his voice. Instead, I focused on my real memories of Grandma Evelyn. The way she hummed while making her famous blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning, how she would sit with me for hours in her sunroom while I painted,
offering gentle encouragement and occasionally sharing stories about her own unfulfilled dreams of becoming an artist. Evelyn Thornfield was a pillar of Millbrook society, a woman who understood the importance of family legacy and tradition. The irony wasn't lost on me. These same people who were now praising her commitment to family had spent decades questioning her decision to raise me, had made countless comments about throwing good money after bad, and had never missed an opportunity to remind both of us that I wasn't really a Thornfield. I opened my eyes to see Clarissa dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with an expensive handkerchief as she prepared to take the podium. Her performance was flawless, the grieving niece sharing precious memories of her beloved aunt. She spoke about holiday traditions and family gatherings, painting a picture of warm togetherness that bore no resemblance to the cold, awkward meals I remembered, where conversations stopped when I entered rooms and resumed in whispers after I left. Evelyn Thornfield taught us the importance of family. She showed us that blood is thicker than water and that we must always protect what our ancestors built for future generations. Several people in the congregation nodded approvingly, and I realized that most of them had no idea what my relationship with Grandma Evelyn had really been like. To them, I was exactly what Clarissa had painted me to be, a charity case who had taken advantage of an old woman's kindness. When Patricia stood to read her poem, I noticed Mr. Morrison shift in his seat and check his watch again. The poem was saccharine and generic, filled with cliches about angels watching over us and memories that never fade. It was clear she had found it online rather than written it herself, but the mourners applauded politely when she finished.
As the service continued with hymns and more speeches from family friends, I found myself studying the faces around me. These people were already dividing up Grandma Evelyn's legacy in their minds, already making plans for what they would do with her estate, her collections, her house. The way Clarissa kept glancing at her watch and whispering to Harold suggested they had somewhere important to be after the service. The reading of the will, no doubt. The thought sent a chill through me. I had no idea what Grandma Evelyn had planned for her estate, but I knew it wouldn't be good news for me. These people had made it clear that they considered me an outsider, a burden, someone who had already received far more than I deserved. As Mr. Jameson announced the final hymn, I watched Mr. Morrison gather his things with deliberate care. There was something about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, that suggested he was preparing for battle rather than a simple legal formality. When the service ended and people began filing out, offering condolences to the family in the front rows, I remained seated. I wasn't ready to face another round of pitying looks or whispered comments about my future. But as the chapel emptied, Mr. Morrison approached my pew, his expression serious but not unkind. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I need you to come to my office this afternoon for the reading of your grandmother's will. 2:00 sharp." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. As he walked away, I caught sight of Clarissa and Harold near the chapel entrance, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Whatever they were planning, whatever they thought they knew about what came next, there was an energy about them that suggested they were very, very confident about the outcome. Looking at Grandma Evelyn's casket one last time, I whispered a silent goodbye and prepared myself for what I was certain would be the final humiliation in a day full of them. The October wind whipped through the cemetery as I stood alone by Grandma Evelyn's freshly covered grave, watching the last of the mourners climb into their expensive cars and drive away. The Thornfield family had departed immediately after the burial service, not bothering with the traditional gathering that usually followed funerals. There would be no shared memories, no comfort food, no coming together in grief. They had somewhere more important to be. I pulled my thin black cardigan tighter around my shoulders and tried to make sense of how drastically my world had changed in just 3 days. On Monday morning, I was Victoria Winters, the granddaughter of one of Millbrook's most respected residents, living comfortably in the beautiful Victorian house that had been my home for as long as I can remember. By Thursday afternoon, I was apparently nothing more than a family embarrassment whose very presence at her grandmother's funeral was considered an insult to the Thornfield legacy. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had always felt more like a Winters than a Thornfield anyway. My father, David Winters, had been what the family called unsuitable when he married my mother, Catherine Thornfield. He had been a struggling artist, a dreamer who painted landscapes and portraits with more passion than profit. The family had never forgiven my mother for choosing love over social status, and they certainly hadn't forgiven me for existing as living proof of that choice. But Grandma Evelyn had been different. She had loved my father's artistic spirit, had encouraged my mother's rebellion, and had embraced me as the granddaughter she had always wanted, rather than the burden the rest of family saw me as. After my parents died in that terrible accident on Route 9 during a winter storm, she hadn't hesitated to take me in, despite the obvious disapproval from Uncle Harold and the others. "Victoria, darling," she used to tell me as I grew up, "never let anyone make you feel small because of where you came from or what you don't have. The most beautiful things in life can't be bought or inherited. They have to be created with your own hands and your own heart." Those words had sustained me through years of family gatherings where I was the odd one out, through holiday dinners where conversations became stilted when I joined them, through countless subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that I wasn't really one of them. Grandma Evelyn had made sure I never felt unwanted in her house, but she couldn't shield me from the reality that the rest of the family saw me as an outsider who had overstayed her welcome. Living in the Thornfield mansion on Elm Hill Road was like existing in two different worlds simultaneously. With Grandma Evelyn, it was a place of warmth and creativity. She had converted the entire third floor into an art studio for me, with tall windows that caught the perfect northern light and enough space for me to spread out canvases and experiment with different techniques. We would spend hours up there together, her reading her mystery novels while I painted, occasionally sharing comfortable silence or deep conversations about art, life, and dreams. But whenever other family members visited, the house transformed into something cold and formal. I learned to recognize the sound of Uncle Harold's Mercedes pulling up the circular driveway, the sharp click of Aunt Clarissa's heels on the marble foyer, the way Cousin Patricia's voice carried through the halls as she made pointed comments about certain people living off family generosity. During those visits, I would retreat to my room or the art studio, making myself invisible until they left. The contrast was especially stark during the monthly family dinners that Grandma Evelyn insisted on hosting. She believed in maintaining family traditions, even when it was clear that the family barely tolerated each other, let alone me. Those evenings were exercises in careful navigation, where I learned to speak only when spoken to avoid topics that might remind anyone of my father's artistic pretensions, and to endure their thinly veiled comments about my future prospects. "Victoria really should think about getting a more substantial job," Clarissa would say over dessert, her tone suggesting that my part-time work at the Millbrook Public Library was somewhere between a hobby and a character flaw. 28 is rather old to still be dependent on family support. Harold would nod approvingly while cutting his apple pie with surgical precision. "In my day, young people were expected to make their own way in the world. Character building, you understand?" Patricia, who had never worked a day in her life thanks to her trust fund, would add her own observations. "Some people just aren't cut out for independence, I suppose. Not everyone can handle real responsibility." Grandma Evelyn would deflect these conversations with the skill of someone who had been managing family politics for decades, but I could see the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands would slightly clench in her lap. She protected me as much as she could, but she couldn't change the fundamental reality that I would never be accepted as a true Thornfield. What made it worse was that I had genuinely tried to earn their respect over the years. I had graduated summa cum laude from Connecticut College with a degree in fine arts, despite having to work part-time throughout school because I refused to ask for more financial help than absolutely necessary. I had spent my summers volunteering at the Millbrook Community Center, teaching art classes to underprivileged children. I had even attempted to get more traditional jobs, but Grandma Evelyn had always discouraged it. "Your art is important, Victoria," she would insist whenever I brought up getting a corporate job or pursuing a more conventional career. "The world has enough accountants and lawyers. It needs more people who can create beauty, who can see what others miss." I had believed her, had trusted that my artistic pursuits had value, even if they didn't translate into financial independence.
But standing alone in the cemetery, watching the last car disappear around the bend toward town, I realized how precarious my position had always been. Without Grandma Evelyn's protection and support, I was exactly what the family had always said I was. A 28-year-old woman with no real career, no significant savings, and no clear path forward. The part-time library job barely covered my personal expenses, and I had no idea what would happen to my living situation now that Grandma Evelyn was gone. The house on Elm Hill Road was worth easily $2 million, and my art studio alone was larger than most people's entire apartments. I had been living a life I could never afford on my own, supported by the generosity of a woman who was now gone forever. As I finally turned away from the grave and began walking toward my small Honda Civic, the same car I had been driving since college, I tried to prepare myself for whatever humiliation awaited me at Mr. Morrison's office. The family had made their feelings about my future very clear. Now I would discover exactly how much control they would have over the rest of my life. Morrison and Associates occupied a stately brick building on Millbrook's historic Main Street, with its polished brass nameplate and ivy-covered walls, giving it the kind of old money respectability that the Thornfield family valued above almost everything else. As I climbed the worn stone steps at exactly 2 o'clock, I could see through the tall windows that the family had already assembled in the main conference room, their voices carrying through the glass in animated conversation. I paused at the heavy oak door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the brass handle. Through the frosted glass panel, I could make out the silhouettes of at least 6 people already seated around what appeared to be a large mahogany table. The Thornfield contingent had arrived early, probably to discuss strategy or to make sure they presented a united front during whatever unpleasant business was about to unfold. Mr. Morrison's secretary, a kind-faced woman named Eleanor, who had known Grandma Evelyn for decades, looked up from her desk with a sympathetic smile. "Victoria, dear, I'm so sorry for your loss. Mrs. Thornfield was such a wonderful woman." "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The walls of the waiting area were lined with photographs of Millbrook through the decades, and I found myself staring at a picture from the 1950s that showed the town square during some kind of harvest festival. Grandma Evelyn stood in the foreground, young and radiant, wearing a blue dress and laughing at something that someone had said. It was jarring to see her so full of life when I had just watched her being lowered into the ground. "They're ready for you," she said gently, gesturing toward the conference room door. "Just remember, dear, your grandmother loved you very much. Don't let anyone make you forget that."
The words were clearly meant to be comforting, but they only increased my anxiety about what was waiting for me on the other side of that door. If Eleanor felt the need to remind me of Grandma Evelyn's love, whatever was about to happen must be even worse than I had anticipated. I stepped into the conference room and immediately felt the weight of hostile stares. Uncle Harold sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit giving him an air of absolute authority. Aunt Clarissa occupied the chair to his right, her red manicured nails drumming impatiently against the polished wood surface. Cousin Patricia had claimed the seat beside her mother, while her brother Marcus lounged in a chair near the window, checking his phone with obvious boredom. 2 other people I didn't immediately recognize filled out the gathering. A middle-aged woman with severe features, who was introduced as Harold's sister Regina, and an elderly man named Theodore, who was apparently some kind of distant cousin. The message was clear. This was a Thornfield family meeting, and I was definitely not family. "Ah, Victoria," Harold said, without standing or offering any gesture of greeting. "How good of you to join us. Please, take a seat." He gestured toward a single chair that had been positioned directly across from the family group, isolated and clearly meant to emphasize my outsider status. Mr. Morrison entered behind me, carrying a thick leather portfolio and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know this is a difficult time for all of us. Let's just get this over with, James, Clarissa interrupted, her voice sharp with impatience. We all know why we're here, and frankly, the sooner we can settle Evelyn's affairs and move forward, the better for everyone involved. The attorney took his place at the far end of the table and began removing documents from his portfolio with deliberate care. Before we begin with the formal reading, I want to address some assumptions that seem to be circulating about Mrs. Thornfield's final wishes. What assumptions? Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew exactly what he meant. We're simply here to handle the practical matters of settling the estate. No one's making assumptions about anything. Harold leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. James, we appreciate everything you did for my aunt over the years, but let's be realistic here. Evelyn was generous to a fault, sometimes to her own detriment. We're hoping that in her final arrangements, she showed some consideration for the family's long-term interests, rather than continuing to, he paused, glancing meaningfully in my direction, rather than continuing to enable certain dependency situations. The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. To him, I wasn't even worth addressing directly. I was a dependency situation, a problem to be managed rather than a human being who had just lost the most important person in her life. What Harold is trying to say is that we hope Evelyn finally understood the importance of keeping family assets within the bloodline. Victoria has had 25 years of generous support. Surely that's enough charity for one lifetime. Regina nodded approvingly. The girl needs to learn to stand on her own 2 feet eventually. Evelyn's coddling hasn't done her any favors in that regard. She's 28 years old and still playing with finger paints, Patricia said with a laugh that was anything but amused. Most people her age have careers, mortgages, real responsibilities. Instead, she's been living like some kind of artist princess in a fairy tale. Marcus looked up from his phone long enough to add his own contribution. The house alone is worth millions. That money could be put to much better use than continuing to subsidize someone's hobby masquerading as a career. Each comment felt like another weight being added to my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. These people weren't just discussing my future, they were dismantling my entire sense of self with surgical precision. Every choice I had made, every dream I had pursued with Grandma Evelyn's encouragement was being reduced to evidence of my worthlessness and their superior judgment. Furthermore, Harold continued, warming to his theme, we need to consider the practical implications of maintaining that large estate. The property taxes alone are astronomical, not to mention the upkeep, utilities, and general maintenance. It would be fiscally irresponsible to leave such valuable assets tied up in sentiment rather than putting them to productive use. Theodore, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. What we're really talking about here is protecting the family legacy that previous generations worked so hard to build. Evelyn lost sight of that in her later years, but it's not too late to correct course. Exactly, Clarissa agreed, her voice gaining momentum. Victoria, dear, surely you can understand our position. You've had a wonderful run, living rent-free in luxury for your entire adult life. But now it's time to face reality. You need to find your own way in the world, and we need to ensure that family resources are used responsibly. We're not monsters, Patricia added with mock sympathy. We're certainly willing to help you transition to independence. I'm sure we could arrange for a modest settlement, enough to get you started in a small apartment somewhere, maybe even help you find a real job, something in retail or food service where your limited qualifications wouldn't be a barrier.
As I sat there listening to them calmly plan my humiliation and displacement, I realized that this had never been about Grandma Evelyn's death or her wishes. This was about power, control, and finally having the opportunity to put me in what they considered my proper place.
They had been waiting for this moment for 25 years, planning for the day when they could finally express their true feelings without fear of disappointing the woman who had protected me. But as their voices grew more confident and their plans more detailed, I noticed that Mr. Morrison had remained completely silent throughout their entire performance. He sat at the end of the table with his portfolio still closed, watching their faces with an expression that seemed almost amused. "Are you quite finished?" he asked quietly when their self-congratulatory planning session finally wound down. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I saw uncertainty flicker across Harold's confident features. As Mr. Morrison's question settled over the room like a blanket of ice, I found myself transported back through 25 years of similar moments. Times when the Thornfield family had made their feelings about me crystal clear through careful words and calculated silences. The scene playing out in the conference room was nothing new. It was simply the culmination of decades of systematic exclusion that had been building toward this exact moment. I remembered my 8th birthday party, the first one I had celebrated at the mansion after moving in with Grandma Evelyn. She had insisted on inviting the entire extended family, hoping that a child's birthday celebration might bridge the growing divide. Uncle Harold had arrived with his wife and children, bearing expensive gifts wrapped in elaborate paper. But while my cousins received warm hugs and animated conversations about school and friends, I was greeted with polite but distant acknowledgments. "Happy birthday, Victoria," Clarissa had said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes as she handed me a gift box. Inside was a practical set of children's art supplies, not the professional watercolor set I had been dreaming about, but basic crayons and construction paper clearly purchased as an afterthought. Meanwhile, Cousin Patricia, who was only 6 months younger than me, had received a beautiful silver bracelet that obviously cost 10 times as much. Throughout that party, I had watched the adults navigate conversations with careful precision. When Grandma Evelyn spoke about my progress in school or my artistic talents, the responses were always brief and noncommittal. "How nice," Regina would say, before immediately changing the subject to Patricia's piano lessons or Marcus's Little League achievements. The message was subtle but unmistakable. My accomplishments weren't worth celebrating or discussing. By the time I turned 16, the pattern had become so established that I had learned to expect it. Family gatherings followed the same script every time. The Thornfield children would be asked about their plans for college, their extracurricular activities, their future career aspirations. I would be asked if I was keeping busy with my little art projects, as if my dedication to painting was comparable to a hobby like stamp collecting rather than a serious pursuit. During my high school graduation ceremony, I had received the Millbrook High School Fine Arts Award and a full scholarship to Connecticut College. Grandma Evelyn had been beaming in pride in the audience, taking photos and cheering when my name was called. But at the family dinner afterward, Uncle Harold had dominated the conversation with stories about Marcus's acceptance to his prep school's exclusive summer program, while my scholarship was mentioned only in passing as very practical, considering the circumstances. "It's wonderful that Victoria has found something she's good at," Clarissa had said that evening, her tone suggesting that art was a consolation prize for those who couldn't achieve real success. "Not everyone is cut out for demanding careers, after all." The gift exchanges were particularly telling. Every year, I would carefully select meaningful presents for each family member, often spending hours creating personalized artwork or finding unique items that reflected their interests. In return, I received generic gifts that could have been purchased for anyone. Gift cards to chain stores, generic jewelry from department stores, or books about finding your path in life that carried not-so-subtle messages about getting serious about my future. During my college years, the family gatherings became even more pointed in their exclusion. While my cousins' academic achievements were celebrated with expensive gifts and elaborate praise, my Dean's List recognition and art show exhibitions were acknowledged with brief, perfunctory comments. When I won a regional collegiate art competition during my junior year, earning both a cash prize and gallery representation, Harold's response was to ask whether I had considered backup plans for after graduation. "Art is a lovely hobby," he had said during that conversation, his condescending tone making it clear that he considered my passion to be a childish indulgence. But eventually young people need to think about practical matters like health insurance and retirement planning. The summers were no better. While Marcus and Patricia were sent to expensive camps or educational programs designed to enhance their college applications, I was expected to stay home and help with household tasks or find local employment. When I suggested attending an art institute's summer program, the cost was deemed extravagant and impractical, even though it was far less expensive than Patricia's European language immersion trip or Marcus's elite sports camp. Even my college graduation had been marked by the same subtle dismissal. While Grandma Evelyn had hosted a celebration dinner in my honor, the family's attendance felt more like obligation than genuine pride. The conversations that evening focused primarily on Marcus's plans for law school and Patricia's engagement to a banker from Hartford. My summa cum laude distinction and the gallery exhibition of my senior thesis work were mentioned briefly before the discussion moved on to more serious topics. Throughout all of these years, the most painful aspect wasn't the overt cruelty. It was the way they made me feel invisible while maintaining a veneer of family inclusion. They never said directly that I wasn't wanted or valued, but their actions spoke volumes. Every family photo was carefully arranged to minimize my presence. Every conversation was steered away from my interests or achievements. Every milestone in my life was acknowledged with the bare minimum of politeness required to avoid outright rudeness in front of Grandma Evelyn. The pattern was so consistent and so carefully maintained that I had sometimes wondered if they had discussed it among themselves, perhaps deciding collectively on the level of tolerance they would show toward the charity case in their midst. They had perfected the art of making someone feel unwelcome without technically doing anything wrong, creating an atmosphere where I always felt like an outsider looking in on a family that would never truly accept me. Now, sitting in that conference room, watching their confident faces as they planned my future without consulting me, I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day I first arrived at the mansion as a frightened 3-year-old. They had been waiting 25 years for the opportunity to finally openly express what they had been communicating through subtle exclusion all along. But what they didn't know, what they had never bothered to discover during all those years of dismissing me as unimportant, was that Grandma Evelyn had been watching. She had seen every slight, every dismissal, every calculated attempt to make me feel less than worthy of the Thornfield name. And she had been planning accordingly. The silence that followed Mr. Morrison's quiet question stretched between us like a taut wire. And in that moment of suspended tension, something fundamental shifted inside me. For 25 years, I had absorbed their dismissal, their condescension, their carefully orchestrated exclusion, with the resigned acceptance of someone who had been taught that this was simply the natural order of things. I had internalized their assessment of my worth, believing on some level that perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was nothing more than a burden who had been living off undeserved charity. But as I sat in that chair, isolated and surrounded by their smug certainty, watching Harold's confidence flicker for the first time since I had entered the room, I felt something cold and crystalline settle in my chest. It wasn't anger, exactly, though there was certainly fury burning beneath the surface. It was clarity, the sudden, sharp realization that I had been playing their game by their rules for my entire adult life, accepting a role they had assigned to me without ever questioning whether their assessment was accurate. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly examine what I had accomplished despite their constant undermining. I had graduated summa cum laude from one of Connecticut's most competitive colleges while working part-time to minimize my financial dependence on Grandma Evelyn. I had won regional art competitions, had my work displayed in galleries, and had even sold several pieces to collectors who recognized talent when they saw it. I had volunteered hundreds of hours at the community center, teaching children who reminded me of myself that creativity was valuable and worthy of pursuit. More importantly, I had maintained my integrity and kindness in the face of decades of subtle cruelty.
I had never responded to their provocations with meanness of my own, had never stooped to their level of petty vindictiveness, had never allowed their treatment to turn me bitter or resentful. Grandma Evelyn had raised me to be better than that, and somehow, through all of their attempts to diminish me, I had managed to remain true to the values she had instilled.
As these realizations washed over me, I became acutely aware of how completely they had underestimated me. They saw a dependent, directionless woman who painted little pictures as a hobby while living off family generosity. They had never bothered to look deeper, to understand the strength it had taken to pursue my dreams in the face of their constant discouragement, or the resilience required to maintain my sense of self while being systematically excluded from their definition of family. What they had interpreted as weakness, my quiet acceptance of their treatment, my reluctance to fight back or make scenes, had actually been strategic patience. I had learned early that confronting them directly would only provide ammunition for their narrative that I was ungrateful, difficult, or emotionally unstable. Instead, I had chosen to focus my energy on building something they couldn't take away from me: my skills, my education, my character, and my relationship with the one person in the family who truly valued me. But now, as I watched them congratulate themselves on finally having the opportunity to put me in my proper place, I realized that their celebration was premature. They had made the fatal error of assuming that because Grandma Evelyn was gone, I was powerless. They had spent so many years dismissing me as inconsequential that they had failed to consider the possibility that the woman who had protected me for 25 years might have prepared for exactly this scenario. The thought of Grandma Evelyn brought a sharp pang of grief, but also something else, a warm certainty that felt almost like her presence in the room. During her final months, as her health had begun to decline, she had spent increasing amounts of time in private meetings with Mr. Morrison. I had assumed these were routine legal consultations about her various investments and charitable commitments, but now I wondered if there had been more to those conversations than I had realized. She had also begun asking me strange questions during our evening talks in the sunroom, questions about my long-term goals, about whether I truly wanted to continue living in Millbrook after she was gone, about what I would do if I suddenly had complete freedom to pursue my dreams without financial constraints. At the time, I had thought she was simply encouraging me to think independently about my future. Now I suspected she had been gathering information for purposes I hadn't understood. There had been other signs, too, that I was only now beginning to piece together. The way she had insisted on updating all of her legal documents earlier in the year, despite Mr. Morrison's assurances that her existing will was perfectly adequate. The private conversations she had begun having with Eleanor, Mr. Morrison's secretary who had been her friend since childhood. The mysterious phone calls she had made to people in Hartford and New York, conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. Most tellingly, there had been the changes in how she spoke about the family during our private moments together. Where she had once made excuses for their behavior or encouraged me to be patient with their shortcomings, she had become increasingly direct about what she observed. "Victoria, darling," she had said just 2 months before her death, as we sat watching the sunset through the tall windows of her bedroom, "I want you to remember something important. The measure of a person's worth isn't determined by what others think of them, especially when those others are motivated by jealousy or small-mindedness. Some people," she had continued, "spend their entire lives waiting for other people to give them permission to be extraordinary. Don't be one of those people, Victoria. When the time comes, trust your instincts and don't let anyone convince you that you're less than you are." At the time, her words had seemed like general encouragement about pursuing my artistic career. Now, sitting in this conference room while her relatives planned my humiliation, I wondered if she had been preparing me for something much more specific. The realization that Grandma Evelyn might have anticipated this exact scenario and might have taken steps to protect me from it sent a surge of hope through my chest that I had to work hard to conceal. If I was right, if she had seen through their facade of family concern to the calculating cruelty beneath, then perhaps this meeting wouldn't unfold the way they expected. I forced myself to remain perfectly still, to keep my expression neutral and defeated, even as my mind raced through the possibilities.
They were so confident in their position, so certain that they held all the cards, that they weren't even bothering to watch for signs that their assumptions might be wrong. They were performing for each other, reinforcing their shared narrative of righteous family responsibility, completely oblivious to the fact that their intended victim might not be as helpless as they believed. Mr. Morrison had remained silent throughout their entire performance, his portfolio still closed, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his posture, a tension in his shoulders, that suggested he was prepared for something they weren't expecting. When his eyes briefly met mine across the table, I caught a glimpse of what might have been approval, or perhaps anticipation. For the first time since entering the room, I allowed myself to hope that this story might have a different ending than the one they had written for me.
As I sat there watching the family's confidence begin to waver under Mr. Morrison's steady gaze, my mind drifted back to a conversation I had overheard 6 months earlier, one that at the time had seemed like nothing more than family gossip, but now took on an entirely different significance. I had been returning from the library on a Wednesday afternoon when I heard raised voices coming from Grandma Evelyn's study. The door was slightly ajar, and though I had no intention of eavesdropping, Harold's booming voice made it impossible not to overhear. "This has gone on long enough, Aunt Evelyn," he had been saying, his tone carrying the kind of authority he typically reserved for his law practice. "The girl is 28 years old. When are you going to stop enabling this fantasy and help her face reality?" "And what reality would that be, Harold?" Grandma Evelyn's response had been measured, but I could hear the steel beneath her polite tone. "The reality that my granddaughter is a talented artist who graduated summa cum laude from one of Connecticut's finest colleges? Or the reality that she's a kind, intelligent young woman who has never asked for anything beyond my love and support?" Clarissa's voice had joined the conversation, sharp with frustration. "The reality is that she's a grown woman with no career prospects, no savings, and no plan for independence. You're not helping her by continuing to treat her like a child who can play with paints forever." "I see," Grandma Evelyn had replied, and even from the hallway I could hear the dangerous quiet in her voice. "And I suppose you have suggestions for what I should do instead?" "For starters, you could stop funding her art supplies and studio space. Make her get a real job, something that teaches responsibility and self-sufficiency. The library position is barely part-time. She needs to understand what it means to support herself." "Perhaps," Regina's voice had added, "it's time to discuss more practical arrangements for the future. The estate, the house, the investments. These things need to be managed by people who understand their value and importance." The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with various family members taking turns to express their concerns about my future and their suggestions for how Grandma Evelyn might better prepare me for the real world. But what had struck me most forcefully, even then, was how they had talked about me as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved and supported. That evening, after the family had left, I had found Grandma Evelyn in her bedroom, sitting in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea cooling on the side table beside her. She had looked older than I had ever seen her, and for the first time, I had realized how much their constant pressure was wearing on her. "Grandma," I said, settling onto the ottoman beside her chair, "I heard some of what happened this afternoon. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should think about getting a more traditional job, finding my own place. I don't want to be a burden to you." She had looked at me for a long moment, her blue eyes sharp and penetrating despite her 78 years. "Victoria, do you remember the story I used to tell you about your great-great-grandmother, Amelia Thornfield?" I nodded, confused by the apparent change of subject. "The one who started the family business? Who turned a small textile shop into what became Thornfield Industries?" "That's right," Grandma Evelyn had said, reaching over to take my hand. "But do you remember what I told you about her brothers?" The memory had come back slowly. "The ones who thought she was wasting her time with business? They said a woman should focus on marriage and children, not commerce?" "Exactly. They were convinced that her ideas were foolish, that she was too emotional and impractical to understand money and business. They tried everything they could to discourage her, to convince our great-great-grandfather that investing in Amelia's silly notions was throwing good money after bad. Grandma Evelyn had paused to sip her tea, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something I couldn't. Those same brothers spent the rest of their lives living off the success of the business they had tried to prevent her from starting. They never acknowledged that they had been wrong, of course. They convinced themselves that they had always been supportive, that Amelia's success was somehow a reflection of their own wisdom and guidance. At the time, I assumed she was simply sharing family history to make me feel better about pursuing an unconventional path. But now, sitting in this conference room listening to Harold and Clarissa discuss my future with the same dismissive certainty that Amelia's brothers had once shown it, I began to understand that Grandma Evelyn had been drawing a much more specific parallel. The family's treatment of me wasn't new or unique. It was part of a pattern that had been repeating itself for generations. They had always been threatened by anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of success or propriety. They had tried to suppress Amelia's business ambitions, just as they had disapproved of my mother's choice to marry an artist, just as they were now attempting to convince everyone that my pursuit of art was evidence of irresponsibility and poor judgment. But Amelia had succeeded despite their opposition, just as my mother had found happiness despite their disapproval. And perhaps, I was beginning to realize, Grandma Evelyn had been preparing me to follow in that same tradition of quiet defiance. The more I thought about that conversation, the more I remembered other moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. There had been the afternoon when she had insisted on showing me the old financial records from Thornfield Industries' early years, pointing out how Amelia had structured her business partnerships to maintain control even when family members tried to undermine her authority. "Always remember, Victoria," she had said as we examined the yellowed documents in her private safe, "that the people who control the purse strings control the power." Amelia understood that, which is why she made sure her brothers could never vote her out of her own company. There had been the evening when she had brought out a box of old letters from my mother, reading passages aloud that I had never heard before. Letters where my mother had written about the family's opposition to her marriage, their attempts to convince her that my father was unsuitable, their predictions that she would regret choosing love over social standing. "Your mother was braver than they gave her credit for," Grandma Evelyn had said, carefully folding one of the letters. "She knew exactly what she was doing when she married your father, and she never regretted it for a moment. The family expected her to come crawling back when the money ran tight, or when reality set in. But she proved them wrong every single day." Most significantly, there had been the series of meetings she had begun having with various professionals over the past year. Not just Mr. Morrison, but financial advisors, accountants, and even a private investigator whose business card I had glimpsed on her desk one afternoon. When I had asked about these meetings, she had dismissed them as routine estate planning, but the frequency and variety of these consultations had seemed excessive for simple legal housekeeping. "I'm just making sure all my affairs are in order," she had said whenever I expressed concern about the amount of time she was spending on these matters. "At my age, it's important to be thorough about these things." But now I wondered if being thorough had meant something far more comprehensive than I had realized, if she had been gathering information, building a case, preparing for the exact scenario that was now unfolding in this conference room. The family had always made the mistake of underestimating the women in our line, just as they were now underestimating me. They had seen Grandma Evelyn as a sentimental old woman who let her heart override her business sense, never recognizing that her kindness had always been paired with sharp intelligence and careful planning. And if I was right about what she had been doing during those final months,
they were about to discover that their dismissive assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. As the tension in the conference room thickened around Mr. Morrison's unanswered question, I found myself remembering a particularly cruel incident from 3 years ago that had perfectly illustrated just how calculated the family's mistreatment of me had become. It was during Patricia's engagement party, an elaborate affair held at the Millbrook Country Club that had been planned for months and attended by over 200 guests from Connecticut's social elite. I had spent weeks working on a special gift for Patricia, a custom portrait painted from a photograph of her and her fiancé during their vacation in Nantucket. It had taken me nearly 60 hours to complete, working in delicate layers of oil paint to capture not just their likenesses, but the joy and love evident in their expressions. I even had it professionally framed at considerable expense, using money I had saved from my library job. When I presented the portrait during the gift opening ceremony, Patricia had held it up for the crowd to see, and for a moment, I had genuinely felt hopeful that this gesture might bridge some of the distance between us. The other guests had murmured appreciatively, and several people had complimented the technical skill and emotional warmth of the piece. But then, Patricia had set it aside with a dismissive smile and announced to the gathered crowd how sweet that Victoria thinks of her little paintings as real gifts. Of course, for those of us planning a serious adult household, practical presents are so much more useful. She had then proceeded to gush over a set of crystal stemware that cost less than the frame I had purchased, while my hours of careful work were relegated to a corner table with the cards and smaller tokens. The humiliation had been devastating. But what made it worse was the realization that the dismissal had been intentional. Patricia knew exactly how much effort and love had gone into that portrait, and she chose to diminish it publicly as a way of putting me in my place. Later that evening, I had overheard her telling a group of friends that poor Victoria still doesn't understand the difference between hobby crafts and real art, as if my years of training and professional recognition meant nothing. That same pattern had played out repeatedly during family events, each incident carefully designed to reinforce my status as an outsider who didn't understand how things worked in their world. During Marcus's law school graduation celebration 2 years ago, I had been seated at a table with distant cousins and elderly relatives who barely knew my name, while the immediate family occupied the prominent tables near the head of the room. When group photos were taken, I was consistently positioned at the edges or, in several cases, asked to step aside so that just the close family could be photographed together.
The exclusion from family business discussions had been even more systematic. Every time the conversation turned to Thornfield Industries, the various investment properties, or other financial matters, my presence in the room would suddenly become inconvenient. "Victoria, dear, would you mind refreshing the coffee?" Clarissa would ask with false sweetness. "Or perhaps you could help in the kitchen while we discuss these boring business details." I had initially assumed these requests were simply practical. After all, I had no formal role in the family's business affairs. But over time, I had begun to notice that the timing was too consistent to be coincidental. They would wait until I was comfortably settled in a conversation before finding reasons to remove me from any discussion that involved money, property, or long-term planning. The manipulation had extended beyond family gatherings to more private interactions as well. Harold had made a habit of visiting Grandma Evelyn during times when he knew I would be home, then making pointed comments about my lifestyle and future prospects within my hearing. These weren't casual observations, but carefully crafted statements designed to plant seeds of doubt about my value and my place in the family. "I worry about what will happen to Victoria when you're no longer around to support her," he would say, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned compassion. "It's not fair to her, really, allowing her to become so dependent. A young woman her age should be building her own life, not relying on family charity indefinitely." These conversations always followed the same script. Harold would express worry about my future,
suggest that Grandma Evelyn's generosity was actually harmful to my development, and propose various schemes for encouraging my independence, which invariably involved reducing my support and forcing me into what he considered more appropriate employment. Clarissa had perfected an even more insidious approach, using my artistic pursuits as a weapon against my self-esteem. She would arrive for visits armed with newspaper clippings about young entrepreneurs or society women who had built successful careers, reading selected passages aloud while I was within earshot. Listen to this fascinating article about Jennifer Morrison. You remember, Patricia's friend from boarding school. She's just been promoted to vice president at her investment firm, only 29 years old. Isn't it inspiring to see young women taking charge of their financial futures? The message was always crystal clear without being stated directly. Other women my age were accomplishing real things while I was wasting my time with childish pursuits. The articles she chose to share were never about successful artists or creative professionals, only about women who had chosen the kinds of careers the family considered legitimate and worthy of respect. Regina had taken responsibility for the more direct attacks on my character and competence. During family dinners, she would steer conversations toward topics that highlighted my lack of traditional adult milestones: home ownership, marriage prospects, retirement planning, or investment portfolios. She had a particular talent for asking questions that appeared innocent, but were designed to emphasize my financial dependence. Victoria, dear, have you given any thought to opening your own retirement account? It's never too early to start planning for the future, and I'd be happy to recommend my financial advisor. The implication was always clear. Responsible adults planned for their own futures instead of expecting family support indefinitely. The most damaging aspect of their systematic campaign had been how they had gradually isolated me from potential allies within the extended family. Whenever distant relatives or family friends showed interest in my artwork or expressed support for my choices, key family members would have private conversations with them, sharing their concerns about my lack of direction and my unhealthy dependence on Grandma Evelyn. I had watched several potential friendships wither after these interventions, as people who had initially been warm and welcoming became politely distant. They had been convinced that encouraging my artistic pursuits was enabling harmful behavior, that true kindness required helping me face the reality of my situation. Theodore had been particularly effective at this kind of behind-the-scenes manipulation, using his status as a respected member of Millbrook's business community to lend a credibility to their narrative. He would speak sadly about my situation at community events, expressing hope that someone might help me understand the importance of developing practical life skills before it was too late. Even small gestures of kindness from extended family members had been systematically undermined. When my great-aunt Margaret had offered to help me apply for a teaching position at a private art school, Harold had intervened with a lengthy phone conversation about my unrealistic expectations and my need to start at entry-level positions in more traditional fields. The cumulative effect of all these individual incidents had been devastating to my confidence and sense of self-worth. They had created an environment where every aspect of my life was scrutinized and found wanting, where my achievements were dismissed and my dreams were treated as evidence of immaturity and poor judgment. But now, sitting in this conference room and finally seeing their behavior with clear eyes, I understood that their systematic campaign of undermining had been motivated by something far more calculated than concern for my welfare. They had been working methodically to establish a narrative that would justify exactly the kind of dramatic intervention they were now attempting to implement. They had spent years building a case that I was dependent, irresponsible, and incapable of managing my own affairs. They had carefully documented every instance of Grandma Evelyn's generosity as evidence of enabling behavior that needed to be corrected. They had positioned themselves as the responsible family members who had been forced to watch helplessly as a beloved relative made increasingly poor decisions about her legacy.
What they hadn't realized was that Grandma Evelyn had been documenting their behavior just as carefully, building her own case for why they could never be trusted with my future or her legacy. Mr. Morrison's portfolio remained closed as Harold's confident expression began to shift into something resembling uncertainty. But what the family couldn't see from their positions around the table was the small, knowing smile that flickered across the attorney's weathered face, a smile that reminded me, suddenly and powerfully, of conversations I had witnessed between him and Grandma Evelyn during her final months, conversations that I was only now beginning to understand in their proper context. 3 months before her death, I had arrived home from the library to find Grandma Evelyn and Mr. Morrison deep in discussion in her private study, surrounded by file boxes I had never seen before. The door had been partially open, and I had caught fragments of their conversation as I passed by on my way to the kitchen. "The recording quality is excellent, Evelyn," Mr. Morrison had been saying, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "Between the dinner party incident and last week's phone conversation, we have more than enough evidence to establish a clear pattern of deliberate alienation and financial coercion." "And the private investigator's report?" Grandma Evelyn had asked, her tone businesslike in a way I had rarely heard before. "Comprehensive. David's findings about Harold's business practices alone would be sufficient to raise serious questions about his fitness as a fiduciary. The conflicts of interest he's been hiding from his own clients are extensive." I had hurried past at that point, not wanting to appear to be eavesdropping, but the conversation had stayed with me. At the time, I had assumed they were discussing some kind of business matter related to Grandma Evelyn's various investments and charitable commitments. The mention of recordings and investigations had seemed disconnected from anything that might concern me directly. But now, as I watched Mr. Morrison arrange his papers with deliberate precision as the family grew increasingly uncomfortable, I began to understand that those mysterious file boxes and David's investigative reports had been specifically about them and about their treatment of me. The recordings Mr. Morrison had mentioned suddenly made perfect sense. Grandma Evelyn had begun leaving her study door open during family visits in recent months, something she had never done previously. She had also started using the small digital recorder she kept for dictating correspondence in new and unusual ways, often leaving it running during family dinners and gatherings. I remembered one particular evening in late spring when Uncle Harold had launched into one of his typical speeches about my need for independence and practical career development. Grandma Evelyn had sat quietly throughout his entire monologue, occasionally nodding or making small encouraging noises, but I had noticed that her eyes kept drifting to the small silver device sitting innocuously beside her water glass. "I understand, Aunt Evelyn, that we're not trying to be cruel," Harold had said that evening, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he always used when discussing my future. "But at some point, Victoria needs to face the reality that artistic hobbies don't pay the bills. The kindest thing you could do for her would be to establish some firm boundaries about financial support and encourage her to develop more practical skills." Clarissa had joined the conversation with her usual blend of false concern and pointed criticism. "Harold's absolutely right. We've all been enabling Victoria's unrealistic expectations by treating her artistic dabbling as if it were a legitimate career path. She's nearly 30 years old. Most women her age are married with children or building serious professional careers." What I remembered most clearly about that particular dinner was how Grandma Evelyn had responded with unusual questions, drawing them out in ways that seemed designed to get them to elaborate on their positions and make their motivations crystal clear. "I see," she had said thoughtfully. "And if Victoria were to become more financially independent, how do you envision that affecting her living situation here?" The question had prompted Harold to reveal far more than he had probably intended. "Well, naturally, she'd need to find her own place eventually. This house is far too large and expensive for one person to maintain, and it represents a significant asset that should be managed professionally rather than sentimentally." "And her art studio," Grandma Evelyn had pressed gently, "the space on the 3rd floor?" "Could be converted into additional bedrooms or office space," Patricia had interjected eagerly. "Much more practical use of such valuable square footage." The conversation had continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with various family members elaborating on their vision for how the house, the property, and the family assets should be managed once I was no longer dependent on Grandma Evelyn's support. I now realized that Grandma Evelyn had orchestrated that entire conversation specifically to get them to reveal their true intentions on record. She had guided the discussion with surgical precision, asking exactly the right questions to prompt them to expose their plans for my future and their designs on her estate. But the recordings were apparently only one part of a much more comprehensive investigation. The private investigator Mr. Morrison had mentioned, David, whose last name I had never learned, had evidently been gathering information about the family's business practices and personal conduct for months.
I remembered seeing an unfamiliar man in his 50s having coffee with Grandma Evelyn at Millbrook's Main Street Cafe several times during the summer. He had struck me as vaguely professional, with the kind of careful observation skills that made me slightly uncomfortable, even though our interactions had been limited to polite nods. Now I suspected that David had been documenting far more than just casual cafe meetings. The scope of Grandma Evelyn's preparation became even clearer when I recalled the series of meetings she had held with various financial professionals throughout her final year. What I had assumed were routine estate planning sessions had apparently been something far more strategic. She had met repeatedly with tax attorneys from Hartford, investment advisors from New York, and even what she had described as succession planning consultants who specialized in family business transitions. At the time, these meetings had seemed excessive for someone whose affairs were already well organized, but now I understood that she had been building a fortress of legal and financial protections. The most telling detail was a conversation I had overheard between Grandma Evelyn and someone on the phone just 6 weeks before her death. I had been in the sunroom working on a landscape painting when her voice had carried clearly through the open window from her bedroom above. "I want to be absolutely certain that there are no loopholes they can exploit," she had been saying, her tone firm and decisive. "Harold has spent 20 years building his reputation as a legal expert, and Clarissa's family has connections throughout Connecticut's financial community. They'll look for any weakness they can find." The response from whoever she was speaking with had been inaudible, but her reply had been crystal clear. "No, I don't want them to have any warning whatsoever. The element of surprise is crucial. By the time they realize what's actually in the documents, it needs to be far too late for them to mount any kind of legal challenge." That conversation had puzzled me at the time, because it seemed so unlike Grandma Evelyn's usual gentle approach to family conflicts. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over tensions and encouraged everyone to get along despite their differences. But now I understood that her final months had revealed a different side of her character. The same steel that had enabled our great-great-grandmother Amelia to build a business empire despite her brother's opposition. Most significantly, I was beginning to remember details about Grandma Evelyn's behavior during the family's increasingly frequent interventions about my future. Instead of defending me directly or arguing with their assessments, she had taken to asking detailed questions about their specific plans and expectations. "If Victoria were to pursue the kind of career you're suggesting, Harold, what sort of timeline do you think would be appropriate for her transition to complete independence? And if the house were to be sold or converted for different use, what arrangements do you envision for Victoria's personal belongings and artwork?" These questions had always been framed as practical planning inquiries, but they had consistently prompted the family to reveal exactly how little consideration they had given to my welfare in their grand schemes for reorganizing the estate. Most importantly, they had gotten them to articulate their intentions with a specificity that would be very difficult to deny or reinterpret later. As Mr. Morrison finally opened his portfolio and began removing what appeared to be a substantial stack of legal documents, I caught sight of several file folders labeled with names I recognized: Harold, Clarissa, Patricia, and others. But there were also folders marked with terms I didn't immediately understand: audio documentation, financial irregularities, and succession planning alternatives. For the first time since entering the conference room, I allowed myself to believe that this meeting might not unfold according to the family's confident expectations. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and opened the first document in his portfolio, his eyes scanning the room with the measured gaze of someone who had been waiting for this moment for months.
The family's earlier confidence had evaporated into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Clarissa's fingernails drumming nervously against the mahogany table. Before we proceed with the formal reading of Mrs. Thornfield's last will and testament, he began, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to fill every corner of the conference room, I need to address some preliminary matters that Mrs. Thornfield specifically requested be handled first. Harold straightened in his chair, clearly attempting to reassert his authority over the proceedings. James, while we appreciate Evelyn's sentiments, perhaps we could expedite this process. We all have other commitments this afternoon. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Harold, Mr. Morrison replied, and for the first time since I had known him, his voice carried an edge of steel that reminded me powerfully of the tone Grandma Evelyn had used during that phone conversation about legal loopholes. Mrs. Thornfield was particularly concerned about ensuring that all parties involved understood the reasoning behind her final decisions. To that end, she prepared a personal message that she wanted you to hear before any legal documents were discussed. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A recording? That seems rather dramatic, don't you think? Mrs. Thornfield felt it was necessary, Mr. Morrison replied simply, his finger hovering over the play button. Shall we begin? He pressed the button, and suddenly Grandma Evelyn's voice filled the room with a clarity that made my heart clench with fresh grief. But this wasn't the gentle, accommodating tone I had grown accustomed to hearing during family gatherings. This was the voice of a woman who had made her final decisions with absolute certainty and was prepared to defend them. Harold, Clarissa, Patricia, Marcus, Regina, Theodore. If you are hearing this recording, it means that I am no longer here to witness your reaction to my final arrangements. I suspect that some of you will be disappointed, perhaps even angry by what you are about to learn. That is unfortunate, but it is not unexpected. The family members exchanged glances around the table, their earlier smugness replaced by growing apprehension. Clarissa's face had gone pale, while Harold's jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. Grandma Evelyn's voice continued with relentless calm. For the past year, I have been documenting your behavior toward Victoria with the assistance of legal counsel and private investigation services. I have recordings of your conversations during family dinners, transcripts of your phone calls discussing her future, and comprehensive reports about your individual financial practices and personal conduct. Harold started to speak, but Mr. Morrison held up a hand for silence as the recording continued. Harold, your recent handling of the Pemberton estate settlement has been brought to the attention of the Connecticut Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Apparently, representing both the deceased and the primary beneficiary simultaneously, while failing to disclose your personal financial interest in the property being disputed, constitutes what the legal profession calls a serious conflict of interest. Harold's face had gone from red to white so quickly that I wondered if he might actually faint. That investigation was dropped, he stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. Actually, Mr. Morrison interjected smoothly, the investigation was suspended pending additional evidence, which Mrs. Thornfield provided 2 weeks before her death. The committee will be reopening the case next month. Grandma Evelyn's recorded voice moved on with surgical precision. Clarissa, your family's financial advisory firm has been charging management fees for investment accounts that haven't existed for over 3 years. The missing funds have been traced to a series of personal real estate transactions that were never properly disclosed to your clients. Clarissa's mouth opened and closed without sound, her elaborate composure completely shattered. Patricia, your fiancé's family's law firm has been made aware of the rather creative way you've been handling your volunteer position at the children's charity. Apparently, using donated funds to pay for personal travel expenses while filing falsified expense reports is considered embezzlement, regardless of the amounts involved. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't prove any of this. Mr. Morrison reached into his portfolio again and withdrew a thick folder. Actually, Mrs. Thornfield can prove all of it. The private investigator she hired was quite thorough in his documentation. Would you like to see the photographs from your trip to Martha's Vineyard last summer? The ones where you're clearly enjoying accommodations that were supposedly paid for by charity funds designated for underprivileged children? The recording continued as Patricia sank back into her chair. Regina, Theodore, Marcus, each of you has spent considerable time over the past 5 years discussing Victoria's shortcomings and offering suggestions for how I should modify my support of her artistic career and living arrangements. What none of you seem to have realized is that your concerns had nothing to do with Victoria's welfare and everything to do with your own financial expectations. Theodore attempted to interrupt, but Grandma Evelyn's voice cut through his protests with devastating accuracy. Theodore, your assumption that family property should be distributed according to your personal assessment of worthiness is particularly interesting, considering that your own business has been operating at a loss for the past 4 years and is currently being sustained entirely by loans from your wife's family trust. The old man's confident demeanor crumbled as he realized that his financial secrets were no longer private. The truth is, Grandma Evelyn's recording continued, is that Victoria has been the only family member who never asked me for money, never pressured me to change my investment strategies to benefit her personally, and never attempted to manipulate my affection for personal gain. While the rest of you were cataloging her supposed shortcomings, she was caring for me during my illness, managing my household affairs, and providing the kind of genuine companionship that money cannot buy. I felt tears building in my eyes as her voice grew warmer, more personally directed. Victoria, my dear granddaughter, if you are hearing this, I want you to know that every choice I made regarding my estate was made with complete confidence in your character, your intelligence, and your strength. The family has spent years underestimating you, but I have never. Mr. Morrison reached for another document as the recording concluded. Now, regarding Mrs. Thornfield's final will and testament, Victoria Rose Winters, you are the sole beneficiary of your grandmother's entire estate, including the house on Elm Hill Road, all investment portfolios, the family business interests, and all personal property contained therein. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the antique clock on the wall marking each second. Harold's face had progressed through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that suggested he was having difficulty breathing. Furthermore, Mr. Morrison continued, consulting his documents, Mrs. Thornfield has established a charitable foundation in Victoria's name to be funded by the proceeds from the sale of certain non-essential properties. Victoria will serve as the foundation's director with an annual salary of $200,000. Clarissa finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. This is impossible. The family property? The business interests? They can't all go to... I'm afraid they can, and they have, Mr. Morrison replied with satisfaction. Mrs. Thornfield's will is ironclad, prepared by some of the finest estate attorneys in Connecticut and reviewed by tax specialists in New York. Any attempt to contest it will result in the immediate release of all investigative materials to the appropriate professional and legal authorities. As the full implications of what had just occurred began to sink in, I realized that I was no longer the powerless charity case they had spent the morning humiliating. I was now the person who controlled their futures, who held evidence of their professional misconduct, who had the resources to pursue legal action if they chose to make my life difficult. For the first time since entering the conference room, I spoke directly to the family members who had spent decades making me feel small and unwanted. I think, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what was happening, we need to discuss how our family relationships are going to work going forward. The power in the room had completely shifted, and everyone knew it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.